Look at this footage. Or these. An ant attack and Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Well, or this, for example, is also the law of conservation of momentum. A little more, and it would have been a ballistics problem. Every day, we observe the laws of physics in action thousands of times. The very same ones we learned in school, the first, second, and third laws of Newton. And so many things are named after him. There are. Everyone has seen a Newton's cradle like this. It's also sometimes called Newton's cradle. There's also this kind of non-Newtonian fluid made from ordinary starch, which is solid when struck, but quite liquid when handled gently. And this is how Newton's beads behave. The expression, "it's not rocket science," is used when the speaker wants to emphasize the simplicity of the matter. There's also such a curious case. At the Fieldston Upper School in New York, physics teachers stopped referring to Newton's laws, replacing them with 3 fundamental laws of physics to decenter whiteness. After all, physics isn't just about Newton. All that's left is to wait for a Hollywood movie with Morgan Freeman playing Isaac Newton, and justice will be served. But despite such an occasional politically correct gesture, by default, both in the academic scientific world and in ordinary school physics for the average person, only 2 giants are recognized who opened humanity's eyes to physics with a capital P: Newton and Einstein. And while we've already talked about the latter several times, we've somehow overlooked Newton. It's time to fix this oversight. Let's take a look at how great Isaac Newton was, and ultimately, what's wrong with him. Newton's main work is considered to be the book Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, but an earlier work, Optics, is also well known. Newton was engaged in physics and optics from the time he built a reflecting telescope in his youth, for which, in fact, Robert Hooke admitted him to the Royal Society. But Newton did not dare to publish the results concerning light until 1704, and not at all because of his modesty. He waited until Hooke died, because most of the optical experiments and the conclusions drawn from them were either suggested or directly carried out by his mentor. I showed that Mr. Isaac used my hypotheses about impulses and waves. Such a concise and eloquent phrase remained in Hooke's diaries. And now let's see how these 2 fundamental works, Optics and Principia, differ. In Vavilov's book, Isaac Newton, we read, "In Optics, Newton summed up his extensive research in the field of light phenomena. However, much, and sometimes significant material, was not included in this book. Newton strove to write optics as simply as possible, and to make it a work accessible to a wide range of readers and his fellow countrymen. That is why the book was written in English, not in Latin. That is also why it contains almost no mathematical proofs or calculations. The proofs of the propositions and theorems of geometric optics should be sought in the Principia. The mathematical theory of the refraction of light is also published only in the Principia. There is no doubt that during the writing of the Principia, Newton was fully proficient in the methods of fluxional calculus and the method of quadratures, that is, differential and integral calculus. However, the method of fluxions is used only minimally in the Principia. Instead, at the beginning of the first book, a geometric surrogate is presented. If Newton had followed the path of his own invention and written the Principia using the method of fluxions, young students raised on modern analysis would still be reading the book today. In reality, they only read 1 or 2 chapters of the Principia, and even then, only in England. So, what conclusion can we draw from all these quotes? Despite the fact that the Principia is, in theory, a more important work than Optics, it was written in Latin rather than English, which would have made more sense for a wider audience. At the same time, the book does not contain mathematical proofs, even by the standards of that time. As Vavilov writes, it's a geometric surrogate. And now, here's another very important quote. In 1685, Newton hired a secretary, a fellow countryman with the same surname, Humphrey Newton. At that time, he was writing his Principia, says Humphrey. By his order, I copied this magnificent work before sending it to print. So, the manuscript of the Principia was written in a different handwriting, not by Isaac Newton, but by Henry Newton, who shared his surname. Why did the caring relative copy the manuscript before sending it to print? The monumental work seemed to appear out of nowhere. Not a single draft or even a plan for this huge manuscript was found. Meanwhile, Newton's archives contain tens of thousands of drafts of alchemical and theological works that he started writing many times, but then abandoned. Of course, all these facts are not enough to consider the beginning as some kind of deliberate falsification or forgery. But the oddities with this book don't end there. According to Vavilov himself, the direct purpose of the Principia is to prove the law of universal gravitation. But the problem is, the proof is actually missing there. In the table of contents of the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, there is no chapter called Proof of Gravitation or Law of Gravitation. All that's there is a chapter titled Proposition 4, Theorem 4. When bodies move, moving in different circles at uniform speeds, the centripetal forces are directed toward the centers of these circles and are proportional to the squares of the arcs described in equal times, divided by the radii of the circles. There is even a picture, though only in the first edition of the Principia. It strangely disappeared from the later editions. After that, a heroic attempt is made to convert the centripetal force into the force of attraction. This is what it looks like. For this reason, I will now move on to presenting the theories about the motion of bodies that attract each other, considering the centripetal force as attraction. Why is this just an attempt? Because, essentially, it's about two bodies with masses m1 and m2 revolving around a common center along different orbits. With respect to the center, they experience centripetal forces, namely F1 and F2, respectively. These two bodies cannot attract each other with centripetal forces, because the forces are directed toward the center. That's the whole proof, or rather, the lack of it. And it's not some kind of secret or a stretch. In 1960, a book with a simple title was published in the United States, Physics. It was a work by many authors under the auspices of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And in 1965, it was translated into Russian in the USSR. Here is a quote from this book. Unfortunately, we do not know the details of the logical path by which Newton arrived at the law of universal gravitation. That is, as of 1960, American physicists did not have information about how Newton came to justify the law of gravitation. They didn't believe Newton proved the law of universal gravitation. And finally, here's another striking quote from Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, one of our greatest thinkers and scientists, from the book The Biosphere and the Noosphere. The concept of gravity, which quickly evolved into the concept of universal gravitation, was not introduced by Newton. He publicly and in private correspondence argued against it. There is another strong argument that many people are not aware of. It concerns that very formula everyone knows from school. Newton doesn't mention anything about any gravitational constant. According to the official version of the History of Science, the gravitational constant was measured by Henry Cavendish, but he is also a very mysterious and strange historical figure. Judge for yourself. Here are a few quotes about him from the book series Science, Greatest Theories, Issue 46, Pure Attraction, Cavendish, Gravitational Constant. Unfortunately, there is no evidence about Cavendish's student years, no stories or letters from which we could form a clear picture. Perhaps Cavendish did attend classes, but we do not know that. Henry Cavendish entered Cambridge as a fellow commoner. Such students made up about 10% of the student body at Cambridge in the 18th century, but they stood out thanks to their more refined clothing and the presence of servants, who were sometimes students from the poorest backgrounds. Fellow commoners dined in the main hall and had access to the wine cellar, where they could smoke clay pipes and sample Spanish and French wines. Cavendish enjoyed the privileges of his rank. In 1753, Cavendish completed his studies at the university without receiving a degree, so he could devote himself passionately to science at home. There is only one portrait of Henry Cavendish. Henry's shyness also affected his scientific work. He published very little of what he researched. And here's something from Wikipedia. The scientist's will contained a categorical demand that the crypt with his coffin be walled up completely immediately after the funeral, and that there be no inscriptions outside indicating who is buried in this crypt. That's exactly what happened. Cavendish was buried in Derby's Cathedral. The body wasn't examined, and no autopsy was done. Cavendish was quite a mysterious character, Is it possible that he only existed on paper? Or did he exist in reality, but had nothing to do with any gravitational constant? After all, in Maxwell's work, A Treatise on Electricity and Magnetism from 1873, Newton's law is analyzed in great detail. There is not a single word about any gravitational constant. There's not one word about Cavendish. But Cavendish presented and published measurements of the gravitational constant according to the official history of science in 1798, and Maxwell published his treatise 75 years later, in 1873. How did it happen that he still knew nothing about Cavendish? We have a separate episode about the gravitational constant and gravity itself. For now, let's just add one more detail. Here's what you can read in the Wikipedia article titled Tides. Although the gravitational force of the Sun on the Earth is almost 200 times greater than that of the Moon, the tidal forces caused by the Moon are almost twice as strong as those caused by the Sun. The reason for this phenomenon is described next. This happens because tidal forces depend not on the strength of gravity, but on how non-uniform the field is. As the distance from the source of the field increases, the field's non-uniformity decreases faster than the field's own strength. Since the Sun is almost 400 times farther from the Earth than the Moon, the tidal forces caused by the Sun's gravity turn out to be weaker. It turns out that universal gravitation is not perfectly uniform, but in no physics textbook will you find a single mention of such a phenomenon, the non-uniformity of the gravitational field. However, tides are a topic for a future episode. For now, let's continue talking about the superstar of the scientific world, Isaac Newton. The inscription on Newton's monument, which stands at Trinity College where he studied and taught, translates roughly as, "He surpassed the human race in intellect." The epitaph is written in the same spirit, ending with similar words. Here lies Sir Isaac Newton, a gentleman, who with divine intellect was the first to demonstrate, with the torch of mathematics, the motions of the planets, the paths of comets, and the tides of the oceans. He investigated the differences between light rays and the different properties of the colors they produce, something no one had previously suspected. A diligent, wise, and faithful interpreter of nature, antiquity, and the Holy Scripture, he affirmed the greatness of Almighty God through his philosophy, and by his character expressed evangelical simplicity. Let mortals rejoice that such an ornament to the human race existed. But relatively recently, the Lucasian chair, where Isaac Newton worked, was held by the world-renowned black hole specialist Stephen Hawking, who passed away in 2018. And what did this world-famous scientist have to say about his equally famous predecessor? Here's what he said. Isaac Newton can't be called a likable person. His poor relations with colleagues became widely known. He spent the last years of his life mostly embroiled in scandalous disputes. Newton quarreled with the royal astronomer John Flamsteed, who had previously supplied Newton with data for his mathematical principles, but was now withholding information that Newton needed. Newton would not tolerate such a situation and took it upon himself to join the management of the Royal Observatory, then began pushing for the immediate publication of the results. In the end, he managed to get hold of Flamsteed's work and arranged for its publication with Flamsteed's mortal enemy, Edmund Halley. However, Flamsteed took the matter to court, and the court ruled in Flamsteed's favor, prohibiting the distribution of the stolen work. Newton was angered by this decision, and to get back at Flamsteed, he removed all references to Flamsteed's works in later editions of the Principia. A more serious dispute arose between Newton and the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. Remarkably, almost all the articles defending Newton were written by him himself and only published under the names of his friends. The dispute escalated, and then Leibniz made a mistake by appealing to the Royal Society to resolve the disagreement. Newton, being the president of the society, appointed an impartial committee to review the case, which happened to be made up entirely of Newton's friends. But that wasn't all. Then Newton himself wrote the committee's report and forced the society to publish it, thus officially accusing Leibniz of plagiarism. Still not feeling satisfied, Newton anonymously published a condensed summary of this report in the Royal Society's journal. It is said that after Leibniz's death, Newton said that he took great satisfaction in having broken Leibniz's heart. While both disputes with Flamsteed and Leibniz were ongoing, Newton left his professorship and Cambridge University. He took an active part in the anti-Catholic movement, first at the university and then in Parliament, and was rewarded for this by being appointed to the lucrative position of Warden of the Royal Mint. Here he found a more socially justified outlet for his cunning and bitterness, successfully conducting a large-scale campaign against counterfeiters and even sending several people to the gallows. This long quote proves that the English-speaking world is quite aware of this unpleasant man, as Hawking delicately put it. But in our country, the prevailing opinion is still that Newton was almost a god in the field of physical sciences, although in reality, he was not that well versed in them, especially if you compare his worldview to that of other researchers who worked alongside him. Newton was most afraid of criticism of his writings. Because he was afraid that his mistakes would be discovered, he didn't even send a copy of his Principia to Johann Bernoulli, the most respected mathematician and physicist of that time. The names of his most distinguished colleagues: Leibniz, who developed differential and integral calculus; Hooke, who pondered the law of universal gravitation; Flamsteed, the first to predict the elliptical nature of cometary orbits. Newton demonstratively ignored them and was generally very unfair towards them. To this rough portrait, we can add a few more brushstrokes: a thirst for fame and money, a complete lack of nobility, and pettiness. For example, Newton did not pay a single penny to the publisher of the Principia, Roger Coates, who did a tremendous job drawing numerous illustrations and writing out the formulas that fill the manuscript. In the minds of most Russians, there isn't a portrait of the real person named Isaac Newton, but rather some kind of icon in a lavish wig. It's clear that Newton was not an ordinary person. But who was he in science? A genuine researcher or a talented plagiarist with a bad temper? Here, everyone should answer this question for themselves, either ignoring or considering the facts presented in this episode. There is considerable evidence of severe schizophrenic episodes observed in Newton between 1692 and 1694. It is suspected that this mental crisis was triggered by a fire in his house, during which some of his important manuscripts were destroyed. There was a theory that Newton was poisoned by mercury during his alchemical experiments. However, what triggered the mental disorder is not so important. It is important to understand that Newton had a certain predisposition to this. Since the mental crisis that happened to him at the age of 50 was quite deep and prolonged, knowing the dynamics of schizophrenia, it can be assumed that he had similar mental lapses during childhood and especially often in his youth, although there is no evidence of these events. But there is a lot of evidence about the mental episode of Newton at the age of 50. Here, for example, from the diary of Christian Huygens, dated May 29, 1694. A Scotsman told me, he writes in his diary, that 18 months ago, the famous geometer Isaac Newton fell into madness because of intense studies or excessive distress from losing his chemistry laboratory and several manuscripts in a fire. He made some statements that indicated impairment of his mental abilities. He was immediately taken into the care of his friends, who locked him in a house and treated him, so that now he has recovered his health to the point that he has begun to understand his Principia. Newton became the warden of the Tower Mint in 1696. He was over 50, and all his major works had already been written. Recently, Newton went through that very nervous illness: depression, insomnia, digestive disorders, and bouts of paranoia. Powerful friends were looking for a position for him so that the fragile genius could retire. One of these friends was Charles Montague, president of the Royal Society, Newton's classmate from Cambridge, effectively the head of English state finances, and the founder of the Bank of England. Of course, not the world's first central bank, but the first truly effective monetary authority. Almost every modern coin has a reeded edge, a pattern on its rim. Today, this is more of a decorative element, but back in the 17th century, when marked coin edges became mandatory in England, it had enormous practical value. After all, counterfeiters often trimmed coins around the edges and made new coins from the clippings, but reeding solved this problem. Trimming would damage the edge, making it obvious, and the coin would no longer be accepted. A very complex machine was required for edge marking, but it was not invented by Newton, as false legends claim, but by the Frenchman Pierre Blondeau in 1662, 34 years before Isaac Newton became the warden of the mint. So he didn't invent anything fundamentally new at the mint. All the principles had already been developed. All the machines were already installed and functioning. The scientist became an administrator and a rational organizer. He managed to arrange things so that the mints operated with maximum speed and efficiency. By 1700, there were almost no old coins left in circulation. During this time, Newton, who was also fully vested with the powers of an investigator and prosecutor in counterfeiting cases, secured the conviction and execution of 28 counterfeiters. The great recoinage of silver coins in the 1690s under Newton's leadership did not save the English silver standard. In the 18th century, England switched to gold. But English technical achievements in monetary affairs made a great impression on the rest of the world. In particular, Peter I, while in London with the Grand Embassy, visited the Tower Mint 3 times in 1698, and most likely spoke with Newton there. But again, there is no evidence of this. However, Newton's interest in money was not purely material. Alchemy and financial policy have a deep philosophical connection. After all, for example, mere paper, a base material, gains the power of gold. Or real value, credit, arises from obligations and agreements, that is, from words, from nothing. Apparently, Sir Isaac Newton took up his work at the Royal Mint in the Tower with such enthusiasm, precisely because he considered this work a continuation of the alchemical great work, to which he devoted perhaps even more of his time and creative energy than to differential and integral calculus, the theory of light, and the laws of mechanics. A significant portion of Newton's alchemical writings was acquired by none other than John Maynard Keynes. He is a modern alchemist of finance, and he was the one who sensed this systematic vision in Newton. The pile of alchemical manuscripts was deemed unfit for publication after Newton's death in 1727, and remained so until 1936, when the auction house Sotheby's acquired and sold most of them to the economist John Maynard Keynes. How much do you earn? Isaac Newton would most likely have avoided giving a direct answer to that question, since he was quite a wealthy man. His earnings at the mint were not limited to his salary. He also received a share of the coins produced, which amounted to almost £2,000 a week. This allowed the physicist to become one of the wealthiest people of his time and to join the British elite. Newton was also an investor. He invested profitably for many years, wisely allocating assets in his portfolio between stocks and government bonds. By early 1720, Newton's investment portfolio amounted to £32,000 sterling, which is about $6 million today. It included shares of the South Sea Company, Bank of England Securities, and the British East India Company, from which he received about £1,000 sterling a year in dividends. That's roughly about $200,000 a year, or in today's terms, about 15 million rubles. Many researchers who study alternative history are well acquainted with the names Nosovsky and Fomenko, and the main idea of their concept is the new chronology. Academic historians view this as pseudoscience. However, few people know that the first pseudoscientist in this field may actually have been Isaac Newton. In an attempt to analyze the errors of Scaliger's chronology, he set out to do so in his work Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms. He worked on this book for about 40 years, up until his death in 1727. Briefly, Newton's main conclusions regarding the correction of Scaliger's chronology can be summarized as follows. He shifted part of the history of ancient Greece forward in time by an average of 300 years closer to us, and Newton compressed the history of ancient Egypt into a short period of 330 years, and also moved it a couple of millennia closer to us. He also believed that God specifically chose him to interpret the Bible, and he concluded that the world would not end before the year 2060. So you still have 39 years, and you can ignore all the other scary messages about 2030, 2040, and so on. Don't pay attention to them. These are the unusual details about the famous physicist that we decided to show you. Very few people know about them. Usually, the usual list of popular facts about Newton includes that the apple actually didn't fall on his head, that the elaborate logo featuring Newton was the first logo of the world-famous company Apple, and that he seriously studied alchemy and searched for the philosopher's stone, and other rather insignificant and already overused things. We found something more interesting for you. Give us a like if this video gave you something to think about, and see you in future videos on our channel.